Hello, hello, hello! Welcome back to Cultivating a Civilisational Mindset. This is part 2 of the video, with part 1 being available in the description and the information card here. Do please watch that first, as this will not make sense otherwise. Without further ado, let's get back into it. As promised, I shall also talk about those unsuited to civilization on an individual level, though if I am totally honest, culture still plays a huge part in this. In this case, I am chiefly talking about those people who have come from nominally civilized cultures who nonetheless lack a settled mindset and or a low time preference. The most obvious people in this category include all sorts of addicts, gamblers, indulgent hedonists, those women who waste their 20s and 30s sleeping around rather than finding a good man, and all of those who habitually live paycheck to paycheck and spend all the money they have once they have it. All of those people suffer from high time preferences, which is our evolutionary default, but lack the habit or mindset of long-term thinking necessary to instead have low time preferences. More notable than this though is that there is a whole group of individuals unsuited to civilization, a group we are all familiar with, the liberal modern man, or in other words, the archetypical boomer. As I've mentioned extensively in part 1, a tribal mindset is characterised by nomadism and a high time preference, whilst a civilisational mindset is characterised by settlement and a low time preference. The liberal mindset, however, is a post-civilisational mindset that has instead defaulted back to the worst elements of innate tribal mentality, in that it is also nomadic and encourages consumption here and now without regard for the future, especially beyond one's own lifetime. Firstly, on the front of nomadism, I'm sure I do not need to tell you, but the modern man is one who is free to travel anywhere, live anywhere, and die anywhere. Many modern people like to move away not only from their hometown, city, or village, but away from their regional area or country entirely. The EU's freedom of movement is the epitome of this, with people moving from place to place without restriction or much care. Though this isn't nomadism in a literal sense, it is the civilisational equivalent to nomadism in the modern setting. We on the right call such people anywhere men, as they could live in practically any urban Western environment and be the exact same person. Their self-interest is not tied to their land or even their country, but to their own skills. It is an entirely personal and selfish life that is not conducive to the lasting dynastic improvement expected of true civilization. What the anywhere man does is of himself, for himself, and will die with himself. From this, it is not hard to see how the modern man is also hedonistic and pursues things here and now. To be fair to the liberal boomer, his time preference isn't so high that he lives paycheck to paycheck, but his life is still for him. It is a medium time preference when it really ought to still be a low time preference. However, if I am to be harsh about modern liberalism, I must note that liberalism and its economic model capitalism encourages a high time preference. Capitalism encourages people to spend, spend, spend. Capitalist consumerism is all about buying useless crap whenever you have the money to. Credit cards, subscriptions, the fashion cycle, planned obsolescence, stimulus packages, and so on are all ways to get you to spend right away, not to save for the future. Even inflation, something which most people probably consider to be a natural part of the market, is instead intentionally designed to destroy savings and get you to spend today before your money becomes worth less tomorrow. Needless to say, liberalism is not conducive to civilization, and the boomer mindset it creates is one that encourages short to medium term pleasure at the total expense of the future. It is all too commonly only when a liberal gets old and dies that his descendants get his inheritance, but even then everything he owned is subject to extortionate inheritance tax. It is an anti-civilisational mindset that is totally wrecking our culture and our nation. So, how might we stop this? Paternalism, which used to be the norm throughout the Victorian era, is when those with authority restrict somewhat the freedom of those subordinate to them in those people's own interest. Again, this will make some liberals, leftists and libertarians uncomfortable, but the inescapable fact of life is that some people have good habits conducive to long-term success, whilst others have bad habits conducive to misery, poverty, or the improvident destruction of wealth. The state has long tried to help people through charity, which can be partially state-funded, education and social programs, but with mixed results, especially as the most recent efforts have become wrought with bad philosophy and a failure to understand the human condition. In any case, this is the soft side, but there also needs to be a hard side. So what might this look like? Well, the best example we have is that of Singapore. Singapore, after acquiring independence from Malaysia, which in turn acquired independence from Britain, found itself as a highly developed city-state in a very economically advantageous location with ambitions to be a global trade hub, but with a population that still behaved in the uncivilized and off-putting manner so typical of the Third World. Thus, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew sought to civilize his nation, something he would achieve with authoritarian force. If a man was caught relieving himself in the street, he would be fined or imprisoned. If a man was found dropping chewing gum, he would be fined or imprisoned. If a man was found spitting, as Chinamen apparently have the habit to do, he would be fined or imprisoned. If a man was found dealing drugs, he would be imprisoned and or hanged. All of these policies are still in place today, with Singapore being seen as one of the strictest countries in the world. Yet Singapore today is one of the safest places in the world, has a culture of good manners, and is a place where modern slobbishness is not tolerated. This is the hard side of paternalism. And so, much as the father disciplines his children, sets the bounds of acceptable behaviour, and instills in them an attitude of good manners, a paternalistic state too seeks to do this for its people. But why do this at all? Is it not better to just live and let live, as the liberals and libertarians might argue for? Are these efforts worthwhile? I've made a video recently called The White Man's Burden about the idea behind a Rudyard Kipling poem of the same name. In the poem, Kipling frames Western colonial imperialism as a sacred duty to instill civilization in the third world colonial subjects, even when said people may despise you for it. Ultimately, in that video, I concluded that the framing of the white man's burden was one that put the foreigner first above the ruling nation, and therefore was not in our interest. In the case of paternalism, however, the standards being raised are those of the nation itself. And if the people are encouraged to think more in civilisational terms, the nation itself will over time become increasingly more prosperous. Ergo, paternalism is absolutely in the national interest. There is, of course, the matter of freedom. It is conceivable that, under the guise of paternalism, a state could overstep its bounds and become unjustly oppressive, much like how, under the guise of social justice and social anti-fascism, the modern state has become shockingly tyrannical, though ironically still anarchic in equal measure. However, if we only ever thought about policies in terms of how they might be misused, we likely wouldn't enact anything at all. Instead, we ought to weigh up the benefits, costs, and risks appropriately and let this guide our course of action. On that front, though I obviously have not done a comprehensive cost-benefit risk analysis, my instinct is that paternalism would be beneficial for the nation, as was the case throughout the Victorian era. How might this be done though? How might a hypothetical true right-wing government make people stay within their lands, seek to development, and think in the long term? Who is to say for sure? Perhaps we ought to bring back landed voting. Perhaps there is some other system of incentives we could create. The nitty-gritty policies are unclear and frankly for another time. What is clear now is that this country has for decades been moving away from the civilisational mindset and into the liberal boomer mindset, which has become totally culturally dominant. This must be reversed as soon as possible. Anyway, that is all. Given that this video really covers two topics under one umbrella, that of tribal or clan societies not adapting well to modernity or civilization, and that of paternalistic social intervention, I thought that putting it into two parts was the best course of action. Do please let me know what you think of that decision, as I may do this for some videos in the future. Also, please do let me know what you think about the videos on the whole. Were my points fair, despite how controversial they may have been? I would love to hear your feedback. In any case, I thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and God save the King.